Great. It looks like most people are here, so I'd like to begin. I'd like to welcome everybody to the second in our three-part Monash University webinar series, A Nature Positive Australia. Why does it matter and how do we get there? My name is Anita Foster. I'm an Associate Professor in the Monash Business School, where I teach and research in the area of climate change and environmental law, and lead our Green Lab, the hub for interdisciplinary research at the Business School on climate change and sustainability. And I'll be moderating the session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Monash University in Australia operates on the traditional lands of the people of the East Kulin Nations, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to acknowledge the deep and continuing connection that our First Peoples in Australia have with country, and pay my respects to Bunurong and Wurundjeri elders past and present. I'd also like to start off just briefly setting the scene for today's webinar. We've convened this webinar at this particular point in time as we think it's a really important time to be talking about the Nature Positive goal and what it means for Australia. As we were reminded in the first webinar of these series, for those of you who were able to join us last Thursday, around the world and in Australia, we're witnessing alarming rates of biodiversity loss and environmental degradation, with massive implications for the wide range of ecosystem services on which human society, human economy depends. Since the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed in 2022 under the International Convention on Biological Diversity, we have, however, seen a number of really important policy opportunities open up in Australia to address the biodiversity crisis. So the Australian government signed up to the Global Biodiversity Framework and released the Nature Positive Plan at the end of 2022, which sets out a series of reforms to our primary environmental law in Australia, the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, which regulates biodiversity at the national scale, and also introduced the nature repair market. More recently, this year in June, the Australian government released the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which sets out a series of reforms designed to manage financial risks posed to business and the financial system by climate change and other sustainability issues, and also help to align private capital to meeting global sustainability goals, including those set out in the Paris Agreement. And although there's a climate-first approach indicated for this strategy, there's also an indication that in the future, these reforms will expand to address other sustainability issues, including nature and biodiversity. And of course, in a couple of weeks, the Australian government will be hosting the first Global Nature Positive Summit in Sydney. So within these developments, and indeed more broadly, we're seeing increasing use of this term nature positive. It's an overarching goal, a target used to guide policy and interventions and private sector initiatives to address biodiversity loss. So where does it come from? This nature positive goal has been developed and advocated largely by civil society groups, and it was particularly prominent in the lead up to the 2022 International Biodiversity Conference. The intent was to have a science-based approach to really drive responses across different levels of government and in the private sector, similar to the net zero goal that we have in the international climate change regime, which has had such an impact in shaping both government policy responses, but also private sector approaches to climate change. Now, the term nature positive itself is not used explicitly word for word in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but the goal is certainly broadly reflected in the targets and scoping and conceptual framework set out in the Kunming GBF. And while there are some different formulations and certainly differing interpretations of this term nature positive, the definition that's set out on the slide, which has been developed by the Nature Positive Initiative, is widely gaining traction. So this definition frames nature positive as a global societal goal to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 on a 2020 baseline and achieve full recovery by 2050. It notes that delivering on this goal will require measurable net positive biodiversity outcomes through the improvement in the abundance, diversity, integrity, and resilience of species, ecosystems, and natural processes. And right at the end, it emphasises that this will improve nature's ability to contribute to human well-being. So for this webinar series, we really wanted to convey that we need insights from a range of different disciplines and a range of different areas of practice to really explore what the Nature Positive Goal means to Australia. And we also wanted to share some insights from current and ongoing research here at. So in our first webinar last week, we started by explaining and exploring some of the scientific underpinnings for the Nature Positive Goal and profiling some new science-based tools for measuring and supporting nature positive land use and negotiating land use trade-offs. The key takeaways for me were around the scale and the urgency of the problem of biodiversity loss, but importantly also that we have the scientific basis to understand the key drivers of this biodiversity loss and this loss of ecosystem function. And indeed, we have that information to guide decision-making to halt and reverse this loss. Today, in the second webinar, we turn to explore some of the policy opportunities to address biodiversity loss in Australia, exploring how we can better use law and regulation at the federal level, particularly, to support the Nature Positive Goal. And then on Wednesday, we'll reconvene for the final webinar in this series, which will feature insights from the social and behavioural sciences, which help us to really kind of narrow in on which actors, which behaviours we need to shift to achieve the Nature Positive Goal, which are the most promising levers for behavioural change. And given their importance in the context of the Nature Positive Goal, we're focusing particularly on the land and finance sectors in that webinar. So I'll just introduce the three speakers for today. To start off with, we have Associate Professor Jerry Naxam. Now, Jerry works at the Faculty of Law at Monash University, where he specialises in international environmental law. And Jerry will introduce us to international biodiversity law, its promise and its failures, including the latest developments in international biodiversity law, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Then we'll welcome Ella Vines. Ella is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Monash Business School Green Lab, working on our Net Zero Nature Positive Australian Companies project. And Ella will be reflecting on whether and how the Nature Positive Goal finds its way into Australian environmental law through the regulatory and market reforms that are set out in Australia's Nature Positive Plan. And then I'll come back and take you through a presentation which looks at the influence of corporate law on company approaches to nature and biodiversity loss, and explores the potential but also the limits of recent reforms in sustainable finance to strengthen regulatory pressure on companies to align with the Nature Positive Goal. A quick disclaimer before we turn to Jerry. With these three presentations, we're covering some important areas of law and policy relevant to the Nature Positive Goal in Australia, and primarily those at the federal level. These are certainly not the only relevant areas of law and policy, and indeed state-level environmental and planning laws, which we don't have time to cover today, are also very critical parts of the regulatory puzzle. So I'll welcome Jerry. While Jerry is setting up his slides, I'll remind everyone that we'll have a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A and we'll come to them at the end. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides. Anita, please nod. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for having me today. So my task is to basically, I guess, set the scene for what is the current international biodiversity law. It may be familiar to some of you, but for others, perhaps this is a sort of primer to what the situation is. And as Anita said, I'm really going to hit some of the highlights here. And so hopefully to sort of set it up for my other colleagues today to sort of really drill down into nature positive. So my focus today will be on international biodiversity law. And you can never get the slide to move when you want it to. Come on, slide. No. There's always going to be a problem. All right. So basically, if we look at biodiversity at the international law level, there are a number of key conventions that very much focus on biodiversity issues. And the main one is obviously the Convention on Biological Diversity, which came into force in 1993. But we have a number of other key ones that sort of, set the overarching sort of parameter for what's going on here, which is the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species from 1983, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora from 1975, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture from 2004, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands from 1971, the World Heritage Convention in 1972, the International Plant Protection Convention 1952, and the International Whaling Commission from 1946. But there are also hundreds of other biodiversity adjacent sort of treaties, but these are the main ones that are out there at the moment. And given the nature of what we want to look at today in this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on the Convention on Biological Diversity. So if we have an overview of that particular treaty, the parties to the convention there affirm the sovereign rights over the biological resources found within their countries, while at the same time accepting responsibility for conserving biological diversity and using biological resources in a sustainable manner. And the key three objectives of the CBD are set out in Article 1, and they are the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and thirdly, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. From an international law perspective, it's quite interesting because it recognises for the first time that the conservation of biological diversity is a common concern of mankind. Right? Interestingly, again, from a legal perspective, while it's an integral part of the development process, it does not utilise what is known as the common heritage language first promulgated by Ambassador Pardo of Malta in the late 1960s to the UN. Rather, it's a sort of downgraded assessment where it focuses merely on the idea that it is a concern of all of us to deal with the concept of biological diversity. So the basic provisions within it also continue on to talk about the idea that the agreement covers all ecosystems, species, and genetic resources. And it attempts to link traditional conservation efforts to the economic goal of using biological resources sustainably. Unfortunately, from our perspective, it never really defines what we mean by sustainable usage in a way that, particularly from a lawyer's perspective, that we could actually operationalise it effectively. However, it does set principles for the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources, particularly for those in the example in plants, those things destined for commercial use. And thankfully, it created for the first time a legally binding arrangement for access to and the sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources. Biodiversity within the convention is defined to encompass all aspects of variability evident within the living world, including the diversity within and between individuals, within populations, between species, and more importantly, communities and ecosystems on land and water, which before this had not been considered a major component of any sort of treaty in this area. The convention puts special emphasis on genetic diversity, given that genes provide the blueprint for the construction and functioning of various organisms. From a legal point of view, the final text obliges parties to 1, develop national strategies for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. 2, to integrate conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity into economic development policies and programs. 3, to provide inventories of biological resources and to monitor such resources and processes. And 4, to preserve Indigenous conservation practices. And unfortunately, what we found is that there seems to be quite a lot of confusion about how to define conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And there's often conflict between the conservation and preservation goals and a lack of understanding. And thirdly, we've also noted that within the inventories of biological resources, which states are required to have, those inventories have not been carried out properly. And so there's often quite a lot of confusion about what biological resources states actually have and how best to protect them. So, Article 3 reasserts the sovereign rights of states to exploit their own resources and to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction do not cause harm to other states. Article 15 also recognises the sovereign rights of states over their natural resources, and it's proved to be rather problematic from a legal point of view, because while international law really says that exploitation, the way lawyers use it, is more to do with the rational utilisation of those resources, it has meant over time that effectively nation states have been free to carry on their own attempts to both utilise resources, but also in terms of protection. So this puts control of genetic resources in the authority of the relevant state, to be usually laid down by national legislation, and provides that access to the material should be by mutual agreement, Article 15.4, of the state and the commercial companies wishing to prospect for and potentially exploit or rationally utilise the material. Article 16 of the CBD also obliges parties to respect Western intellectual property regimes, and this was very much a provision that developed states fought to ensure within the CBD, to ensure that their intellectual properties rights would not be in any way traduced. Now, jumping ahead in time, we come to what's called, as Anita pointed out, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that was adopted at COP15 in 2022 and on the very last day of negotiations. And what the GBF, as it's known, aims is to address biodiversity loss, restore ecosystems, and protect Indigenous rights in this space. And so its mission is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and by 2050, ensuring biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and widely used in terms of maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people, which is very much consistent with the nature positive goal. The plan therefore includes concrete measures to halt and reverse nature loss, including putting 30% of the planet and 30% of the degraded ecosystems under protection by 2030. Now, the GBF itself consists of 4 overarching global goals to protect nature, including 1, halting human-induced extinction of threatened species and reducing the rate of extinction of all species tenfold by 2050. It also aims for the sustainable use and management of biodiversity to ensure that nature's contributions to people are valued, maintained, and enhanced. Thirdly, it asks for the fair sharing of the benefits from the utilisation of genetic resources and digital sequence information on genetic resources. And lastly, that the adequate means of implementation of the agreement be accessible to all parties, particularly least developed countries and small island developing states. So within that, it has 23 major targets to achieve by 2030, and they include a number of key ones I just want to highlight for us today. Effective conservation and manage of at least 30% of the world's land, coastal areas and oceans. Currently, 17% of land and 8% of marine areas are under protection at this time. A restoration of 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems. They seek to reduce to near zero the loss of areas of high biodiversity importance and high ecological integrity. They want to halve global food waste, phase out or reform subsidies that harm biodiversity by at least 500 billion per year, while scaling up positive incentives for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. They seek to mobilise at least 200 billion per year from public and private sources for biodiversity-related funding, and they want to raise international financial flows from developed to developing countries of at least 30 billion US a year, and they want transnational companies to be required and financial institutions to monitor, assess, and transparently disclose risks and impacts on biodiversity through their operations, portfolio, supplies, and value chains. It's also requesting that the Global Environmental Facility set up a special trust fund, the GBF fund, to support the implementation of the GBF in order to ensure an adequate, predictable and timely flow of funds. States also approved a series of related agreements to implement the GBF on planning, monitoring, reporting and review to ensure there's not, as the goal is, a further acceleration in the global rate of species extinction, which is already at least tens to hundreds of times higher than it's averaged over the past 10 million years. And as UNEP Executive Director Inga Anderson pointed out at the close of the COP, implementation is now key, and success will be very much measured by our rapid and consistent progress in implementing what we've agreed to. And the entire UN system is geared to support its implementation so we can truly make peace with nature. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing there and return it back to Anita. Over to you, Anita.
Great, thanks, Jerry. That's a nice introduction to the Global Biodiversity Framework and where it sits under the UN Convention. Ella Vines will now reflect on how it finds its way into Australian environmental law.
Thank you so much, Anita. Just confirming that everyone can see my slides. If you could nod, Anita, thank you. So if I can get my slides to change. Here's an outline of what I wish to discuss with you today. First, I will discuss the state of play in the urgent reform of Australia's environmental laws. So I'll discuss the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999, which I will refer to as the EPBC Act. I will discuss Australia's 2022 Nature Positive Plan, and I will discuss Australia's new nature repair market. Then I will consider whether there is a role for the nature positive goal under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to shape Australia's environmental law reforms. I will focus on two areas here. First, whether this goal can help to shape integrated responses to biodiversity loss and climate change. And secondly, whether this goal includes non-Western concepts of nature. Finally, I will discuss the translation of the Global Nature Positive goal to the Australian national scale. Here, reflecting the questions set in the previous section, I will ask, are Australian policies pursuing an integrated approach to climate change and biodiversity? And are First Nations perspectives addressed in Australia's climate change and biodiversity policies? So let's get into it. Turning to the state of play in Australian environmental law at the federal level. So first, let's consider the EPBC Act. The basics are that the EPBC Act establishes a system of environmental impact assessment for projects at the federal level that works in conjunction with similar state level laws to regulate impacts on nature and biodiversity. The EPBC Act requires actions that will have a significant impact on matters of national environmental significance to seek the approval of the Environment Minister prior to commencement. But this system is not protecting Australia's environment. In 2020, the independent Samuel review of the EPBC Act found that Australia's natural environment and iconic places are in an overall state of decline and are under increasing threat. They are not sufficiently resilient to withstand current, emerging or future threats, including climate change. The deficiencies of the EPBC Act are numerous, but I will highlight three for the purposes of today. First, regulation of climate change impacts under this legislation is incidental and limited. So climate change impacts are not defined as matters of national environmental significance under the EPBC Act. To put it more colloquially, there is no climate change trigger. Because the EPBC Act does not explicitly address climate change, the Environment Minister has considerable discretion to approve high-emitting projects. This is something that was highlighted again recently with the approval of the extension to Whitehaven Coal's Narrabri mine, Mac Energy's Mount Pleasant mine, and Yancoal's Ravensworth mine. Amendments to the EPBC Act to include an explicit climate change trigger that would require assessment of projects with significant impacts on climate change have long been advocated, but never implemented. This issue was most recently revisited by the Samuel Review, which did not support the introduction of a climate change trigger, but instead argued that new legally binding national environmental standards should require project proponents to disclose the full emissions of proposed developments and to explicitly consider the effectiveness of actions that could be taken to avoid, mitigate, or offset impacts of proposed developments on matters of national environmental significance under climate change scenarios. However, these national environmental standards have yet to be implemented. More on this later. Of course, we know that intact, functioning ecosystems are more resilient to climate change. Therefore, in addition to regulating climate change directly, we also need to think about how to strengthen the capacity of our environmental laws to preserve and restore the environment. This leads me to my next point, which is that the EPBC Act focuses on threatened species and places less emphasis on functional ecosystems and natural processes. In webinar 1 in this series, both Melody and Saxby discussed the wide range of indicators critical to understanding nature-positive outcomes and the need to think not only about threatened species and protected areas, but also the functional diversity that different species contribute at different scales. So the EPBC Act is focused on threatened species and less focused on functional ecosystems and natural processes. The last efficiency of the EPBC Act I wish to highlight relates to environmental offsets. The Samuel Review found that the offsets policy under the EPBC Act was not being applied in accordance with its avoid, mitigate, offset hierarchy, and that in practice, developers negotiated offsets at the outset of a project prior to exhausting options to avoid or mitigate impacts. The Samuel Review recommended introduction of legally enforceable national environmental standards that would, among other things, minimise harm to matters of national environmental significance by requiring proponents to employ all reasonable measures to avoid and then to mitigate significant impacts, and then lastly apply appropriate offsets. So, how have these recommendations been responded to? I'll now turn to consider Australia's Nature Positive Plan. Australia's Nature Positive Plan sets out 3 tranches of reforms. So these 3 tranches are, first, the establishment of the nature repair market to channel private capital to nature protection and restoration. And legislation to introduce this market was passed in late 2023. Then there's tranche 2, which involves the establishment of a new federal environmental regulator, Environment Protection Australia, as well as a new environmental data agency, Environmental Information Australia. Legislation was introduced in May 2024 to establish these entities, and this legislation includes an overarching definition of the term nature positive, which is the first domestic legislation to have such a definition worldwide. Then there's tranche 3, which is the introduction of legally enforceable national environmental standards to guide assessment and approvals and other decision-making under the EPBC Act. And these are yet to be implemented. Now, this is problematic because tranches 1 and 2 of the reforms need to be guided by tranche 3. That is, the implementation of legislated national environmental standards is essential to more effectively protect the Australian environment and to support the achievement of nature-positive outcomes, including via the nature repair market. So, for example, Australia's Nature Positive Plan indicates that the proposed national environmental standards will guide First Nations engagement and participation in decision-making, which I will discuss in more detail later. It also mentions regional planning. So in relation to this, achieving the objectives of the nature repair market will involve resolving trade-offs and enhancing synergies between different land uses, including agricultural production, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity conservation. Overarching environmental standards can play an important role in guiding the development of regional plans to guide the strategic restoration and protection of nature. So we really need this tranche 3 to guide the other reforms for those reforms to be effective. Turning now to the nature repair market. So legislation to establish this market was passed in 2023, and the market itself is expected to come into operation in December this year. The objectives of this legislation reflect Australia's commitments under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Global Biodiversity Framework. And these include to promote the enhancement and protection of biodiversity in Australia, including meeting the goal of no new extinctions and promoting the engagement of market participants, including private enterprise. The nature repair market will allow eligible persons, which includes individuals and companies, to apply to register a biodiversity project with the Clean Energy Regulator. A biodiversity project will generate a tradable biodiversity certificate constituting personal property and representing a biodiversity outcome owned and traded separately from the underlying land. A register of biodiversity certificates will be operated by the Clean Energy Regulator. Biodiversity certificates will not be able to be used for an environmental offsetting purpose. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the state of play in the reform of Australia's environmental laws. Now I will consider whether the global nature positive goal can guide better positive outcomes under these reforms. So just to recap on a few key points from Anita's introduction today, the Global Nature Positive Goal was developed leading up to the negotiation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity to address rates of biodiversity loss worldwide. And the intention is to address a gap in the international biodiversity regime, which lacked a science-based approach with equivalent normative force to the net zero goal in the climate regime. The nature positive goal is not expressed verbatim in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but it's consistent with several references dispersed throughout the text, as Jerry outlined earlier today. In considering the capacity of this goal to influence nature positive outcomes at the Australian scale, I'll consider the following two questions. So first, can the Global Nature Positive Goal shape integrated approaches to climate and biodiversity? And secondly, does this goal include non-Western concepts of nature? So zooming in on each of these questions for a moment, why do we need integrated approaches to climate change and biodiversity? Well, it's important to pursue both goals because if nature's capacity to absorb carbon is diminished, or if the carbon stored in nature is disturbed, then the carbon is released into the atmosphere. Therefore, natural climate solutions, for example, regreening and avoiding further degradation of intact natural systems, have a significant role to play in achieving the net zero goal. At the same time, depending on their design and location, some decarbonisation strategies have the potential to lead to further loss of biodiversity, which undermines the nature positive goal. So it's important to ensure that both goals are pursued concurrently. The relationship between the net zero and nature positive goals is increasingly being acknowledged in related fora and policy development processes. But regulatory instruments and activities that influence approaches to climate change and biodiversity loss do not always recognise these linkages and either address climate and biodiversity risks and impacts in isolation or prioritise one over the other. Turning now to whether the Global Nature Positive Goal includes non-Western concepts of nature. So the definition of nature positive that's gaining prominence from the Nature Positive Initiative includes a definition of nature drawn from IPBES, and I've included that definition on the slides. And you'll see that this definition refers to both Western and non-Western concepts of nature. So it refers to nature within the context of other knowledge systems, including categories such as Mother Earth and systems of life, and is often viewed as inextricably linked to humans, not as a separate entity. So I want to consider how the nature positive goal is translating at the Australian scale through these two questions of integrated approaches to climate and biodiversity, as well as inclusion of non-Western concepts of nature. So this specifically translates to these two questions. First, are Australian policies pursuing an integrated approach to climate change and biodiversity? And second, are First Nations perspectives addressed in Australia's climate change and biodiversity policies? So Australia's Nature Positive Plan of 2022 mentions the risks global warming poses to Australia's unique ecosystems and the link between climate and biodiversity. In the Nature Positive Plan, the federal government says they will address this by embedding climate considerations in all roles and functions of government, But as flagged earlier, climate change considerations are not well integrated in the EPBC Act. The Nature Positive Plan also mentions First Nations participation in improved management of Australia's land, fresh waters and sea, and also talks about a new national environmental standard for First Nations engagement and participation in decision-making to be developed as a priority to enable First Nations views and knowledge to be considered in all project approvals and planning decisions under Australia's national environmental law. But again, these national environmental standards are yet to be implemented. Turning again to the nature repair market, this provides opportunities for an integrated approach to climate change and biodiversity loss. Although there is some interaction between the two schemes, there's some gaps in the way they've been designed. And so they've not been designed in a way which would easily allow market participants to achieve climate and biodiversity goals concurrently, and which would ensure that climate change outcomes are not achieved at the expense of biodiversity outcomes. So in some ways, these two schemes don't interface well. For example, there's a different approach to crediting outcomes under each scheme. A single Australian carbon credit unit represents 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, and multiple Australian carbon credit units are awarded for each project, whereas each eligible biodiversity project under the Nature Repair Scheme will be issued a single biodiversity certificate representing diverse biodiversity outcomes. Another contrast is that, unlike the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme, the nature repair market does not interface with legal obligations to mitigate adverse impacts on biodiversity, as biodiversity credits generated cannot be used for an environmental offsetting purpose. This separation of the nature repair market from offsetting obligations is important to align the market with the nature positive goal, with its focus on biodiversity gains and improvements. However, the lack of a compliance market may also impact on demand for biodiversity credits in other ways. For this reason, it's important that Australia's sustainable finance reforms are progressed swiftly to help generate investment in nature repair and demand for nature repair market biodiversity credits, including through the introduction of mandatory nature risk reporting standards. And this is something that Anita will be discussing later on today. Also, addressing supply-side challenges will be critical to scaling up land sector participation in the nature repair market. Turning now to the extent to which the nature repair market has been designed to include First Nations perspectives, there are some notable differences between the integrity standards of the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme and the nature repair market, including in relation to the consistency with Indigenous knowledge and values. So I think there have definitely, at face value, been some learning applied in the design of the nature repair market based on the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme experience. So conditions in the nature market methodology determinations must be consistent with relevant Indigenous knowledge and values relating to biodiversity and cultural heritage, so far as it is reasonably practical. In contrast, the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme contains no express mention of First Nations perspectives, though in practice some of the approved methodologies draws from First Nations practices, for example, the Savannah fire management methods. Just to conclude with some key takeaways before I hand over to Anita, Australia's Nature Positive Plan seeks to respond to the failures of the EPBC Act to protect nature, but the most urgent reforms, the binding national environmental standards, have not yet been implemented. So what role is there for the global nature positive goal in ensuring better outcomes for nature in Australia? The nature positive goal derived from the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework provides opportunities for nation states to adopt integrated approaches to climate and biodiversity that include both Western and non-Western concepts of nature. The translation of the nature positive goal to the Australian national scale, as exemplified by the new nature repair market and Australia's nature positive plan, shows that there is room for improvement in relation to pursuing an integrated approach to climate change and biodiversity, and including First Nations perspectives. Now I'll hand back to Anita. Thank you very much.
Sorry, just a moment. Here we go. Great. Hopefully you can see my slides now. Excellent. So thank you, Ella. I'm actually going to shift from talking about substantive environmental law and regulation to another area of law and regulation completely, sustainable finance, which is essentially corporate law and the associated regulation of financial markets. And I want to consider the role of this area of law in regulating nature-related risks and impacts in the private sector. So much of the debate and discussion in this area of sustainable finance has to date been about climate change. And I think for our purposes today, it's quite instructive to look at the developments in sustainable finance in relation to climate change, because it gives us some important indications of the potential and the limitations of this area of law and regulation to also contribute to nature positive outcomes in Australia. So I'm going to explore in this presentation the legal and regulatory context for sustainable finance in three interconnected or interrelated parts. Firstly, underlying corporate law obligations on companies and directors to disclose and manage financial risks posed by sustainability issues like climate change or nature loss. Secondly, private regulatory activity, and here I mean the activities of non-governmental actors, such as investors or civil society, which are quite important in shaping corporate approaches to risk disclosure and management. And then thirdly, targeted sustainable finance regulation, by which I mean recent interventions by government to further shape private sector risk management. And I'm interested in this presentation in two main questions. The first is, how does this area of law and regulation influence corporate approaches to climate change and nature? This might be in terms of influencing corporate targets or transition plans, or the way companies allocate capital, perhaps shifting it away from harmful activities to climate solutions or more sustainable activities. And what's important to note here is this area of law and regulation is ostensibly about managing financial risks to companies posed by sustainability issues, but it can also potentially influence corporate approaches to addressing adverse impacts of their business on climate or on nature. So greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, habitat destruction, etc. Because ultimately, addressing these impacts in a timely, effective way is what we need to do to meet both the net zero goals of the Paris Agreement and the emerging nature positive norms and the goals of the global biodiversity framework. So the second question then is, are there opportunities to strengthen incentives for aligning corporate risk and impact management with the net zero and nature positive goals? So the foundation for this area of regulation is understanding both climate change and nature loss as financial risk issues for business. And it's very well recognised now, of course, that climate change can pose material financial risks to companies. The figure at the top of the slide is taken from a report which dates now to 2017, produced by the Bank of England, which is just useful to remind us of the two main categories of climate-related financial risk: transition risk and physical risk. Companies with high emissions, companies in the fossil fuel value chain that are directly responsible for adverse impacts on the climate are more exposed to transition risks such as legal and policy change, market shifts, technology shifts, reputational issues. Whereas companies with physical assets, companies in the agriculture sector, for example, that are more directly exposed to the physical impacts of climate change, such as extreme events, shifting rainfall patterns, etc. And all of these risks have flow-on implications for financial implications for companies, potentially in terms of lower asset values, lower productivity, lower profits, stranded assets. Flow-on implications for the financial institutions that lend to, invest in, or insure these companies, and associated risks to financial stability. So more recently, we've seen a very similar framing emerge of nature-related risks, and the figure on the slide is taken from the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures report of 2023. which again talks about these two main categories of risk, transition and physical risks. So transition risks at the company scale might take the form of regulatory developments to protect nature, market pressure to address nature-related impacts, reputational risks, and companies that are directly responsible for adverse biodiversity impacts, such as habitat destruction or pollution, will be more exposed to these transition risks. Physical risks might take the form of declining ecosystem services on which businesses rely, such as fresh water, pollination services, protection from extreme events, and companies with a close interface with nature are more exposed to these types of risks. Again, just with climate change, there is an articulation of how these types of risks might result in financial impacts for companies in the form of higher or more volatile prices, disruption of business processes and supply chains, damage to assets, stranded assets. And all of these risks have flow-on effects at the financial sector and financial system scales and can contribute to financial stability risk. So once you frame climate change and nature loss in that way as a financial risk issue, it enlivens obligations under corporate law to both disclose and manage these risks. So under our corporations law in Australia, companies and company directors have obligations to quantify and discuss any material financial risks posed to the company in the annual report, and these obligations are underpinned by penalties for misleading and deceptive conduct. Company directors also have legal duties to act with due care and diligence, to act in the best interests of the company, and this then translates to an expectation that company directors will be actively considering financially material risks to the company and taking reasonable, proportionate steps to manage those risks. Over the last few years, our corporate regulators in Australia, ASIC and APRA, have certainly increased their regulatory scrutiny of climate risk reporting particularly, recently taking enforcement action against some entities for misleading and deceptive reporting in relation to climate change or greenwashing. So while companies and directors certainly have clear obligations to disclose and manage material financial risks posed by climate change and also nature loss or biodiversity loss, it's important to just recognise the underlying nature of these legal obligations. These are principles-based obligations, risk regulation or informational regulation. What they are aiming to do is raise awareness about risks, ensure transparent sharing of risk information in order to ensure that material risks are considered and priced in financial decisions. So the underlying purpose is to protect market stakeholders, shareholders and others, and ensure transparent, efficient markets as the basis for maintaining financial stability. The other important point to note about these obligations is there's quite a lot of discretion built into these obligations around companies in determining the materiality of climate change to their business, and also in terms of company directors in determining what's a reasonable and proportionate response to material financial risks and what is in the best interests of the company. There's no substantive direction in corporate law, of course, to manage these risks that might be posed by climate change and nature loss in any particular way. So that's where this second part of the regulatory context becomes quite important. So I want to talk quickly about private regulatory activity in both the climate change and a nature space. If we take climate change first, here what we're talking about is initiatives involving non-governmental actors, investors and civil society in developing best practice industry standards for climate risk disclosure and management, and then engaging in various activities to drive the uptake of these standards. And that might be investor engagement, voting on shareholder resolutions, and in some cases, strategic litigation seeking to enforce these standards. Now, this activity is quite important in shaping expectations around risk disclosure and management. What's considered material by investors? What do they expect in terms of risk management, given the underlying legal obligations are principles-based and not directing companies and directors on how to address risks. And what I wanted to emphasise is that over time, these initiatives in the climate change space have coalesced around some common substantive standards, which really emphasize the importance of moving beyond thinking about financial risks to company interests at the entity scale and in the short term, to considering longer-term risks and addressing more systemic, economy-wide risks of climate change. So they do this by trying to push companies to align their risk management to the Paris Agreement, particularly the net zero goals, and as part of this, push companies to mitigate adverse impacts for which they're responsible, so greenhouse gas emissions, in line with global goals. I've got a few examples of these initiatives on the slide. The TCFD will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure. It's been around since 2017, but it was really important in establishing this recommendation that companies should be analysing their risk exposure using emissions reduction scenarios that align to the Paris Agreement goals, and that companies should be setting quantified targets to address climate-related risks, including in relation to their greenhouse gas emissions. The Science-Based Target Setting Initiative is another example of an industry standard. It provides a methodology and an accreditation platform for Paris-aligned company climate targets and reporting annually against these. In terms of investor engagement, Climate Action 100+ is a great example, as well as behind-the-scenes engagement. This is an initiative involving many very large institutional investors that group together and target their engagement at a set of companies that are critical for the energy transition, and as well as private behind-the-scenes engagement with these companies. As I said, they've developed a net zero company benchmark, which is a public measure of climate performance, publicly available, measuring companies on whether they have a science-based Paris-aligned emissions reduction target, whether they have a decarbonisation strategy with interim targets and a clear allocation of capital to achieve their targets. Finally, two examples of strategic litigation on the slide, seeking to enforce corporate law obligations as they relate to climate change. The Santos litigation is ongoing in Australia. It's a case brought by the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, arguing that Santos, in its annual report of 2020, has made misleading and deceptive statements in relation to a number of things, including that it has a clear and credible plan to meet its net zero emissions targets when it continues to pursue new oil and gas projects and purports to rely on carbon offsets and carbon capture and storage to meet its targets. The other case on the slide is also useful to mention, a case brought by Client Earth in the UK against another big oil and gas company, Shell, arguing that company directors were in breach of their duties of due care and diligence, duties to manage the company in the duties to act in the best interests of the company, because they'd failed to adopt and implement an energy transition strategy in line with Paris Agreement goals. Now, this case was unsuccessful. The court reinforced the considerable discretion that company directors have to consider how best to manage climate-related risks and what are the best interests of the company. And on that second point, really reinforced quite a narrow view of the best interests of the company that focuses on existing shareholders and more short-term considerations. Similar litigation may well emerge down the track in the UK or more broadly in other jurisdictions as the financial materiality of climate change and understanding of that increases. So in a nature space, we're seeing quite similar developments emerge. In terms of industry standards for risk disclosure and management, we now have the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which has done some really critical definitional work in thinking through nature-related issues for companies and investors, defining them as dependencies, impacts, risks and opportunities, recommending, like the TCFD, that companies disclose a risk assessment that identifies dependencies and impacts in its value chain and looks at the potential financial implications for the company, and that the company sets targets to reduce its impacts and address its risks. On the note of targets, we now have the science-based targets for nature, like the SBTI, a multi-stakeholder initiative that's developing methods to underpin and certify science-based targets for nature, for companies. And these really focus on encouraging companies to set targets to avoid and reduce their contribution to key drivers of nature loss, and to set targets to restore and regenerate ecosystems. And then in terms of investor engagement, Nature Action 100 is again quite similar to Climate Action 100+, an investor-led engagement initiative developing a similar performance benchmark that will measure and publicly report on the nature-related performance of companies, including whether they've publicly disclosed their nature-related risk assessments and targets to avoid and reduce their impacts on nature. So similarly to the climate change space, in this private regulatory space, we're seeing common substantive standards emerge, which again move beyond just thinking about financial risks to company interests at the entity scale and in the short term, to considering longer term risks and helping to address more systemic risks of biodiversity loss. And they're doing this by pushing companies to align their risk management to global goals, as set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework and this nature positive norm, and also pushing companies to mitigate their adverse impacts in line with global goals. Okay, the third part of the framework, sustainable finance regulation. As I said, the Sustainable Finance Roadmap was released in June this year. Two main objectives: to enhance the management of sustainability risks by companies and investors to help maintain financial stability, and secondly, to align private capital to sustainability goals such as those set out in the Paris Agreement. Now, Australia is taking a climate first but not only approach, and one of the first concrete reforms to be delivered is mandatory climate risk reporting, and amendments to the Corporations Act passed a few weeks ago, and standards are being developed and finalised by the AASB. Now, this is a really important reform because it clarifies the financial materiality of climate change and removes some of the discretion within disclosure obligations and directors' duties that I mentioned previously. It does largely maintain this focus on reporting financial risks to company interests posed by climate change, but it does gently, I would say, encourage companies to also consider longer-term risks and mitigating their adverse impacts on the climate by requiring them to report the results of scenario analysis, including Paris Agreement goals scenarios, and requiring them to provide comprehensive reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions, including Scope 3. There are a number of other elements to the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which I won't get into today, other than to say that the government has committed to provide guidance for climate transition plans to ensure they're credible. And this is really, really important. However, so far, there's no indication that the government will require transition plans to align with Paris Agreement goals. Okay, to wrap up, what's the potential of this area of regulation to drive progress in the private sector towards the nature positive goal? And what are the limits? Firstly, this first kind of question of how does this area of law and regulation influence corporate approaches to climate change and nature loss? I think we can learn quite a bit from the experience with climate change in this space, because there's quite a lot of evidence, a number of studies exploring corporate responses to these reforms in relation to climate change. And to summarise, generally what we've seen is highly variable, often poor quality disclosure of climate-related risks, quite weak alignment to Paris goals, poor treatment of longer-term risks, and little effective and timely mitigation of adverse impacts in line with global goals, which is so necessary to manage the broader economy-wide systemic risks posed by climate change. And these findings, I think, have been observed particularly for companies that are critical to the energy transition, so fossil fuel companies, energy companies, high emitters or responsible for adverse climate change impacts, and therefore vulnerable to transition risks over longer timeframes. So generally speaking, while net zero targets have certainly proliferated, these have not often been backed up with robust strategies, including interim targets, capital allocation away from fossil fuels towards climate solutions. While we've had increased regulatory scrutiny of greenwashing behaviour and some really important strategic litigation on the go, such as the Santos case, This is really important in drawing attention to these issues and particularly highlighting the lack of reasonable basis for many disclosures and targets that companies have put forward, and can certainly help drive more robust disclosures. But it also appears to have had the effect of companies winding back their climate commitments with this observed phenomena of green hushing. And finally, I think a key learning from the climate space, and particularly the litigation we've seen seeking to enforce directors' duties as they apply to climate change with the Shell case in the UK, is a real reminder of some of the limits of existing corporate law. Corporate law is really about financial risks to company interests, and we tend to think of company interests in the near to medium term with quite a narrow focus on shareholder interests. And there's quite a bit of discretion within corporate law in terms of how companies and directors should approach these risks. So it's reasonable to expect that all of these limitations will emerge similarly in relation to nature-related risks, perhaps even more so given the challenges of understanding and quantifying biodiversity risks at the entity scale, and the heightened complexity of understanding nature-related impacts and dependencies when they often occur in really complex international supply chains. So what are the opportunities to strengthen incentives to align corporate risk and impact management with the net zero and nature positive goals? We now have the Sustainable Finance Roadmap. It's a great start. It's really important reform. It is, however, quite tentative and narrow compared to the reforms we've seen develop in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe. So I think there are opportunities to improve the transparency measures that are set out in the Sustainable Finance Roadmap. And I would argue that it's important to make them more explicitly about managing the systemic economy-wide risks posed by climate change and nature loss. And as part of that, about mitigating the adverse impacts that the private sector is responsible for in terms of nature loss and climate change, because this would help to realise that overarching objective of the sustainable finance reforms about aligning private capital away from unsustainable activities in line with global goals. So to do this, I think it's important to move quickly beyond climate change. Mandatory nature-related reporting would be very important. It is also important to consider adopting a more explicit double materiality standard for our sustainability reporting in Australia, in line with developments that we've seen in Europe, particularly, where companies are required not only to report on the financial risks to company interests, but also their impacts on the climate, on nature, on other sustainability values. And this provides stronger incentives for companies to address longer-term risks and address and mitigate their adverse impacts on the climate, on nature, in line with global goals. Although we have a commitment for guidance on climate transition planning, I think that could be hardened and strengthened by considering mandatory transition planning aligned to global goals for certain companies. Again, to strengthen these incentives to align corporate risk and impact management with these really important global goals. Okay, that's it from me. Okay, so we're going to turn now to Q&A, and you might have to just give me a moment to have a quick look at some of the questions that have come through.
Well, one of the questions, Anita, actually, I thought we could start with, because it bridges onto something that you've just discussed, so while it's fresh in everyone's minds. So the question comes from Dan Rogers, and he says, there appears to remain a focus on describing and potentially addressing financial risks to the company. Are there opportunities to reform corporate law in ways that recognise the broader impacts of company activities on commons public good, even where these don't directly increase financial risk to the company? So I know you've been doing a lot of talking, Anita, but I just thought while it's fresh in everyone's minds, perhaps you'd like to address that.
Yeah, thanks, Ella, and thanks, Dan, for the great question. A big yes from me. You really pick up on the limits, I think, of corporate law, that it remains about addressing financial risks to the company. And even with our sustainable finance reforms, which certainly have the potential to strengthen incentives for companies and directors to be thinking about the relationship between their impacts on nature and climate and risks to the company. You could go a lot further by really thinking about some targeted reforms to corporate law. I think the sustainable finance reforms, it's important to kind of interrogate the underlying theory of change behind those reforms, which, they're really about increasing transparency. They assume that market actors like investors will use improved information on sustainability risk exposure, on sustainability performance of companies, to engage with companies, to steward them, to reduce their negative impacts on the climate, on nature, etc. But we need to seriously question whether there really is a sufficient collective of investors that will act in that way. Even long-term institutional investors, have been hesitant to divest of companies that aren't necessarily aligning strongly with these important global goals. They've been hesitant to vote in favour of shareholder resolutions that are seeking to push companies to do that. So I think the sustainable finance reforms will only go so far without broader law reform. And there are, for example, a lot of suggestions that we need novel sustainability duties for company directors under corporate law. And we might also consider the legal duties of trustee directors of superannuation funds, for example, in conjunction, if we really want to broaden the focus beyond thinking just about financial risks to companies.
Thanks, Anita. So we've had another corporate law related question from an anonymous attendee. It says, do you think that company nature related impacts will become mandatory similar to the TCFD? I'll just provide a quick comment, but Anita, then handball to you. Certainly in our work for the Net Zero Nature Positive Australian Companies project, with Green Lab, we've conducted, a regulatory mapping exercise before we then springboard into some empirical studies. But where the regulatory mapping exercise we've done certainly shows that the nature-related impacts and the disclosure of them is following a similar regulatory trajectory to the climate risk disclosure. So we've got the TNFD, which is the counterpart to the TCFD. But Anita, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I'd echo that. And internationally, we've certainly seen international standards develop in that way. The ISSB, next step is looking at nature-related, biodiversity-related disclosures to be informed by the TNFD. It is potentially the case. I think in any case, the TCFD, even before it became mandatory in Australia, that was highly influential in shaping corporate approaches to climate risk identification, disclosure, and management. But we really saw that to lift up climate risk disclosures and make them of value to the users of that information, we needed to make it standardized, and that's why these current reforms to make it mandatory are so important. So I think we could move faster on nature. If this is an issue of materiality for companies, it's an issue of increasing concern for investors. There are broader public interest reasons to address these systemic risks posed by biodiversity loss and really engage companies in doing that. Then we could move much more quickly than we did with climate change and make it mandatory. And that's certainly the direction that the Sustainable Finance Roadmap is going. Okay.
There's a question that's come in from Bob Webb, which is, why did the Samuel Review not recommend a climate trigger, and how effective or serious are state and territory approaches to project assessment and nature positive? So I'll jump in on the first half of that question. So the reason the Samuel Review gave for not recommending a climate trigger was that they noted that the federal government had chosen to regulate climate change separately under separate legislation. So, and at that time, there was the safeguard mechanism, but since then we've seen a suite of reforms like the Climate Change Act with a legislated emissions reduction target and reforms to the safeguard mechanism. So, you know, I certainly have the view that the fragmentation of climate change regulation and environmental regulation is not serving the environment very well. But definitely that's the system that the government has opted for, and that's the reason why the Samuel Review didn't recommend a climate change trigger and instead opted for better, more direct regulation or consideration of climate change impacts by the implementation of national environmental standards. And in terms of how effective or serious are state and territory approaches to project assessment and nature positive, and we've certainly focused on the federal level implementation of nature positive, noting that we now have a definition of nature positive in a bill before Parliament at the federal level. But there it has been some analysis done of New South Wales' approach to biodiversity markets, with the New South Wales biodiversity market being reviewed independently to be ineffective. And interestingly, that market linked biodiversity credits to environmental offsetting compliance obligations. So it's interesting that with our federal nature repair market, there seems to be a learning that separating those two would protect the integrity of nature better. But certainly, you know, I haven't drilled down into a lot of the detail of each state and territory, but New South Wales stands as an example where there's reforms needed to have nature positive approaches integrated, particularly in their market mechanism. So I'll close off on that answer and hand back to you, Anita, to deal with this.
In fact, there's a related question. What conditions would be necessary to create demand for biodiversity credits? Will the only buyers be companies having a negative impact elsewhere? So just to begin answering that question, at the moment, under the nature repair market, biodiversity certificates can't be used to meet an offsetting purpose. So you can't get approval to destroy nature, create harm to nature under the EPBC Act, and then use a nature repair market certificate to offset that. But the issue of demand certainly is a live issue, I think. And I think Ella mentioned, and I would certainly echo, that it's another reason to really push the sustainable finance reforms into the nature space, because if companies are pressured to address their risks and their impacts and set nature-related targets, then this will potentially create important demand for nature repair outcomes that can potentially be delivered under the nature repair market. But yeah, this question of demand is certainly a live one. Ella, while we're on the nature repair market, I don't know whether you want to add to that, but there's another question. How worried should we be that the nature repair market will be administered out of the clean energy regulator who oversaw the carbon offset scheme?
Well, I suppose the starting point for that, answering that, is that there was a review of the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme conducted by Ian Chubb and others, so an independent review, and that recommended that there needed to be more integrity and transparency governance measures in relation to the ACCU scheme. So certainly the Clean Energy Regulator, there's room for improvement in terms of the way the ACCU scheme was managed. So taking a very simplistic, logical approach, I suppose there's concerns that there might be similar problems with the nature repair market. But I do think that the Chubb review outlined some key governance measures that will hopefully, that learning will then filter through to the nature repair market. And that's certainly something we'll be watching for as we get more details of how the nature repair market has been designed. You know, we're getting more details about the regulations underlying the legislation sort of as we speak. So we need to have a close look at the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Review by Chubb and others and see that those recommendations are reflected in the design of the nature repair market. So I think, you know, we can be cautiously optimistic that there's been some learnings from the ACCU experience and the Clean Energy Regulators' management of that, but emphasis on the cautiously optimistic, because it's, you know, our job to watch closely and ensure that those learnings are actually implemented.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. I think there's a question for Jerry here that came in early, and Ella may also like to comment. It's Dan Rogers saying, it strikes me that the evolution of the Convention on Biological Diversity, continues to focus on how we sustainably use nature as a commercial resource, but doesn't appear to adequately reflect the broad range of other ways of framing our relationship with nature, e.g. as kin, or even non-commercial economic uses, sorry, I've talked too much. Subsistence, cultural trade, etc. Do you think there's a role for international agreements and national law in better recognising the value of nature beyond a resource? So perhaps Jerry first, and maybe Ella might comment as well.
Maybe I'll take the international aspect of it. And Dan, the answer is yes, of course, there is a vast space for it. And one of the reasons I think we need to be having a discussion about nature positive is that the way the CBD has been constructed and run over the last 30 odd years has been really much an emphasis on commercial utilisation to the detriment of all other aspects of it. And so, unfortunately, that has opened the door for the very necessary debate around what nature positive would be, because the CBD has literally failed. Every time it's come close to coming up with actual, targets that would be mandatory, it has tended to postpone them out. The latest targets that they're sort of talking about are setting themselves up until 2050 now. So we probably need more urgent action than that. So nature positive obviously is potentially a better way to go. Over to you, Ella.
Thanks, Jerry. So I think this question touches on the very anthropocentric way that our laws have been written. So very human focused, and that's at the international level and has filtered down to the Australian domestic level and other nation state domestic levels as well, where nature is defined in terms of the way that humans can use it. And that's why I'm very interested in whether the non-Western concepts of nature embedded in the definition of nature that's underpinning the nature positive norm can filter through to levels of governance like the Australian national level. So, the definition of nature that I looked at earlier in my slides talked about the fact that non-Western knowledge systems often view nature is inextricably linked to humans, not as a separate entity, so not as an entity for our use, but humans being one part of nature and not superior to it. And so I think that, if those elements of the nature positive goal are strengthened and amplified and implemented at the Australian domestic level and other nation state domestic levels, then there is hope that we can start to move away from the very nature as a resource basis of our laws. And at the same time, while there's a role for us completely reformulating our laws and reimagining them, I think that there's also something to be said for looking at our laws as they are and using the frameworks that we have to try and affect the best outcomes that we can. And I think that's where Anita's presentation really highlighted how corporations law, even though it's there to maximize profit for shareholders, there are ways to consider better environmental outcomes with some limitations within those existing structures. So yeah, that's my response to that question. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, I would just add there's, the framing of nature as a financial risk certainly picks up the kind of nature as a resource, nature as a service to humans. But it's interesting to see, I think, in the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, a stronger recognition than what we've had previously in relation to climate change of the importance of addressing adverse impacts by business on biodiversity, even when they might not be directly, creating financial risks to the business in the short to medium term, because that contributes to broader ecosystem decline and potentially collapse of really key services. So I agree that, it's not perfect, but I think it's quite a useful framing within the legal frameworks that we currently have to potentially achieve some important outcomes for nature. Okay, where are we at with questions?
We've had some great questions. Please correct me if we have already answered it. You'll have to forgive me. But a question here is, what conditions would be necessary to create demand for biodiversity credits? Will the only buyers be companies having a negative impact elsewhere? And that's from Eva Hall. So, you know, we've seen in the New South Wales example that the way to create demand for biodiversity credits under that scheme was to link it to a compliance obligation. But then there was a like-for-like requirement with the compliance obligations under the New South Wales scheme. So the problem is that a lot of biodiversity credits being generated did not match up with the obligations generated under the New South Wales environmental laws. So that doesn't always resolve the demand the demand issues. So I wouldn't say that automatically linking compliance obligations to biodiversity credits generated under the nature repair market would solve that issue. And I think that there's a really good reason why compliance obligations have been separated from the nature repair market, and that's to ensure that we don't go with an offset first policy, but we actually go with that avoid, mitigate, and then offset hierarchy in practice. So something that can help with the creation of demand for biodiversity credits is by extending mandatory disclosure to include nature-related risks. And perhaps, Anita, you'd like to include some comments on that.
Yeah, hopefully I did pick up a little bit of that earlier. Certainly agree that that's a really important way to think about the demand side of the market. If companies are pushed to set nature-related targets and address their impacts on biodiversity, then that's potentially opening up an important stream of demand. I mean, the other issue which we're going to get to in webinar 3 on Wednesday is a bit more about the supply side of the market and, the perspectives of the land sector, particularly in terms of interacting with environmental markets, and some of the kind of barriers and limitations and challenges there will be discussed on Wednesday. There's a question we haven't answered yet, and it's potentially because it's not really within our expertise, but Jerry may be able to comment, I'm not sure. Can you discuss the implications of IP for First Peoples in Victoria, given sovereignty was ceded? How does the state currently own and commercialise genetic IP?
Oh, it's not that I can answer, unfortunately, and it's a really great question. So
yeah, I just wanted to echo that that's a great question, and also flag I'm not an IP lawyer, but
should we take it under advisement and try to get back and answer?
I think we should, and it's an incredibly important answer for us to turn our minds to. So thank you so much for the prompt.
Yeah, thank you. A question for Ella. The nature repair market suggests that one of the methodologies will incorporate a climate and biodiversity method, being that the CER will also administer biodiversity certificates. Do you think that the regulators will solve this carbon biodiversity divide?
Well, I hope that there's not going to be a carbon biodiversity divide. I hope, as flagged in my presentation, that our laws can look at concurrent achievement of the net zero and nature positive goal, and that we ensure that our policies don't undermine the achievement of either. I think that, we flagged earlier that there have been governance issues flagged with the Clean Energy Regulator administering the ACCU market, the carbon market, and that we need to learn from that in the Clean Energy Regulator also being appointed to administer the nature repair market. But I think on the flip side, there's some opportunities for synergies in ensuring that the markets are being regulated in a way that achieves both goals, because if the same regulator is administering that. So I know that's a very general answer, but we are waiting for more detail to come out on how the nature repair market will operate. And it's certainly something we'll be looking at is, what is the impact of having the same regulator for both markets?
Great. I think we've just got a few more questions, time for a few more questions, perhaps just one. We'll see. Is this market approach novel, or is it copying some model that has already worked elsewhere? So as Ella's already discussed, we already have in New South Wales a biodiversity market that's linked to a compliance obligation. So when you harm, reduce, destroy habitat, you're required to compensate, and you can do that by purchasing a biodiversity certificate under that market. To my knowledge, a purely nature repair market is something quite new. Ella, I don't know whether you're able to comment.
No, I mean, I know that they've learned from the carbon market at the federal level in designing the nature repair market, but I haven't analysed markets at other domestic national levels across the globe, but certainly a great prompt. Thank you.
Okay. One more question. Sorry, it's a big one from Dan Rogers. There seems some significant tension between the urgency for transformational change required as per IPBES and IPCC and the relatively conservative tentative approaches to regulatory reform and even more tentative responses to these reforms. Any thoughts on reducing this tension? I think if we had the answers to that, be a great position to be in, and but we would certainly, I think, echo your observation about the huge gap between the urgency of addressing these issues and the very, very slow pace in which governments in Australia and around the world are able to do so.
I'd say at the international level, one of the criticisms of certainly my area of international law, and it relates to the climate and biodiversity, is that because we have treated them for decades as discrete areas, that we've tended not to actually merge them particularly well together. And I know in my discipline, that's kind of the project of the next decade sort of thing. So to answer Dan's question, we're aware of it. At the moment, everyone's just trying to talk more to each other to sort of figure out where the intersections can be improved. That's about it. But it's a massive, massive undertaking.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly get the last two questions. Are the proposed environmental standards available in draft, and what's the process to finalise? There's currently a range of consultations going on, led by DQ, the Department of Climate Change and Environment and Water at the federal level, on the methods and various other rules and standards that will underpin the nature repair market. So take a look at those processes. And finally, there's a question around international law recognising Australia as the sovereign state, but also recognising the rights of Indigenous people, and is there an ambiguity? And it would be great to hear more about this in a future seminar. We certainly hope to be able to host some broader discussions around the topic of nature positive, including from Indigenous perspectives. So watch out for that.
Yeah, and I would say that the pathway to, well, a pathway to better recognising the rights of Indigenous people in Australia is through implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and certainly thinking about how that instrument might facilitate nature positive outcomes is something I'd be really keen to think about and engage with anyone who is also interested in that topic.
Wonderful. Okay. Just to finish off, I'll just remind everyone that we have the third and final in this webinar series on Wednesday. So please join us if you can. This webinar series has been put together by a new network of academics across Monash University. We've called ourselves the Monash Nature Positive Network, and we're interested in developing research and engagement activities around nature, biodiversity conservation, nature positive. We're a network of lawyers, obviously, today, but also social scientists and natural scientists as well. So there's the website for our group, check it out, and also our contact details if you'd like to get in touch with the presenters. A final thank you to Impact Labs in the Monash Business School for their support in setting up and organising this webinar. Thanks very much, everyone.